In the annals of medieval European history, few stories capture the essence of defiant resistance, quite like that of the Albanian knights who stood against the Ottoman expansion into the Balkans during the 15th century. These warriors, emerging from the rugged mountains and fortified towns of Albania, became legendary not for their willingness to negotiate or compromise, but for their absolute refusal to accept any terms of surrender, regardless of how favorable they might appear. Their story is one of extraordinary courage, strategic brilliance, and an unwavering commitment to independence that would inspire generations long after their final battles had been fought. The Albanian resistance to Ottoman domination cannot be understood without first grasping the unique character of Albanian society in the medieval period. Unlike the more centralized kingdoms of Western Europe, Albania was a patchwork of clan-based territories ruled by powerful noble families who commanded the loyalty of fierce warrior communities. These clans had spent centuries defending their mountain strongholds against various invaders, developing a martial culture that prized honor, bravery, and independence above all else. The terrain itself shaped this culture, as the Albanian highlands provided natural fortifications that made conquest extraordinarily difficult. Deep valleys, narrow passes, and towering peaks created a landscape where small groups of determined defenders could hold off much larger forces indefinitely. When the Ottoman Empire began its inexorable push into the Balkans in the 14th century, the Albanian lands represented both a strategic prize and a formidable obstacle. Control of Albania would give the Ottomans access to the Adriatic coast and a secure route for further expansion into Italy and Central Europe. The Ottomans had already demonstrated their military prowess by conquering much of Anatolia and making significant inroads into Byzantine territory. Their armies were well organized, technologically advanced, and backed by the vast resources of a rapidly expanding empire. Most kingdoms and principalities in their path had either been conquered outright or had accepted vassal status, recognizing the futility of prolonged resistance against such overwhelming power. The Albanian nobles initially found themselves in a precarious position. Some, calculating the odds and seeing the fate of their neighbors, did indeed submit to Ottoman authority in the early phases of expansion. They paid tribute, sent hostages to the Ottoman court, and maintained a degree of local autonomy in exchange for acknowledging the Sultan's supremacy. This pragmatic approach wasn't uncommon in medieval politics, where survival often required flexibility and accommodation with more powerful neighbors. However, this arrangement proved unstable and ultimately unsatisfying to both sides. The Ottomans desired complete control and the integration of Albanian territories into their administrative system, while the Albanian nobles chafed under foreign domination and resented the steady erosion of their traditional privileges and independence. The transformation of Albanian resistance from sporadic local uprisings into a sustained military campaign of defiance centered on one remarkable figure, Gjergj Kastrioti, known to history as Skanderbeg. Born into the noble Kastrioti family around 1405, Gjergj had been sent as a hostage to the Ottoman court as a young boy, a common practice to ensure the loyalty of vassal territories. There, he received a military education, converted to Islam as required, and rose to become a capable commander in the Ottoman army. He earned the name Skanderbeg, a title combining Iskander, the Turkish form of Alexander, with Beg, meaning lord or prince, reflecting his military abilities and the respect he commanded. For years, he served the very empire that held his homeland in subjugation, leading Ottoman forces in various campaigns and learning the tactics, strategies, and organizational methods that made the Ottoman military so formidable. The turning point came in 1443, when Skanderbeg made a decision that would alter the course of Albanian history. During a campaign in the Balkans, he abandoned the Ottoman army, returned to his ancestral lands, and immediately declared his reconversion to Christianity and his intention to liberate Albania from Ottoman control. This was not a spontaneous act of rebellion, but rather a carefully calculated move by a man who had spent years observing Ottoman power from within and understood both its strengths and its vulnerabilities. He seized the fortress of Kruja, his family's traditional seat, and from this stronghold began organizing what would become one of the most successful resistance movements against Ottoman expansion in the 15th century. What made Skanderbeg and his Albanian knights truly exceptional was not merely their military skill, but their categorical refusal to entertain any possibility of surrender or accommodation with the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans, experienced in dealing with resistance movements, typically offered generous terms to rebel leaders who would agree to submit. These offers might include recognition of local authority, exemption from certain taxes, guarantees of religious freedom, or positions of honor within the Ottoman hierarchy. Such terms had proven effective in pacifying many other regions, as local leaders weighed the benefits of accommodation against the costs of continued resistance. The Ottomans understood that prolonged warfare was expensive and that co-opting local elites was often more efficient than attempting to completely subjugate resistant populations through force alone. Skanderbeg received numerous such offers throughout his career, each more generous than the last. Ottoman envoys came to negotiate, bringing promises of wealth, territory, and high position if he would only acknowledge Ottoman suzerainty. Sultan Murad II, and later his son Mehmed II, who would eventually conquer Constantinople, both recognized Skanderbeg's military genius and would have preferred to have him as an ally rather than an enemy. They offered him governorship of large provinces, vast estates, and a position of prominence at the Ottoman court. These were not empty promises, but genuine offers backed by the full authority of the Sultan. Other Albanian nobles who accepted such terms lived comfortably and retained significant local power. The Ottomans even offered to recognize Albanian autonomy in exchange for nominal submission and tribute, an arrangement that would have allowed Skanderbeg to rule his lands with minimal interference. Every single offer was rejected outright. Skanderbeg's refusal was not based on unrealistic assessments of military capability or ignorant optimism about eventual victory. He understood perfectly well the disparity in resources between his forces and the Ottoman Empire. Albania was a small, mountainous country with limited population and resources, while the Ottomans could draw upon the wealth and manpower of territories stretching from the Danube to the Euphrates. Yet Skanderbeg recognized that accepting Ottoman overlordship, regardless of how favorable the immediate terms might appear, meant the eventual complete absorption of Albania into the Ottoman system and the loss of Albanian identity, culture, and independence. He had seen how Ottoman administration worked from the inside and knew that initial concessions and guarantees would gradually be eroded until nothing remained of Albanian autonomy. The knights and nobles who rallied to Skanderbeg's banner shared this uncompromising stance. These were not naive idealists, but hardened warriors who had carefully considered their options and chosen defiance over submission. They came from families with long traditions of independence and martial prowess, men who would rather die fighting than live as subjects of a foreign empire. This attitude was reinforced by the structure of Albanian society, where personal and family honor were paramount values. To accept surrender, especially after having raised arms in rebellion, would bring permanent shame not only upon the individual, but upon his entire clan and lineage. The cultural emphasis on besa, a uniquely Albanian concept combining honor, promise-keeping, and personal integrity, meant that once these knights had committed themselves to resistance, abandoning that commitment was literally unthinkable, regardless of the practical consequences. The military campaigns that followed demonstrated both the effectiveness of Albanian resistance and the terrible price of their refusal to surrender. Skanderbeg proved himself a master of guerrilla warfare, using the mountainous terrain to his advantage and striking at Ottoman forces when and where they were most vulnerable. He avoided large-scale pitched battles, where Ottoman numerical superiority would be decisive, instead conducting lightning raids, ambushes, and sieges that inflicted maximum damage while preserving his limited forces. His intimate knowledge of Ottoman military organization, gained during his years of service, allowed him to anticipate enemy movements and exploit weaknesses in their deployments. He understood Ottoman logistics, communications, and command structures, and used this knowledge to disrupt their operations repeatedly. The Ottomans responded with overwhelming force. Sultan Murad II personally led multiple campaigns into Albania, bringing armies that vastly outnumbered Skanderbeg's forces. These were not minor punitive expeditions, but major military operations involving tens of thousands of soldiers, siege equipment, and substantial logistical support. The Ottomans were determined to crush the Albanian rebellion, both as a matter of strategic necessity and as a demonstration to other potentially rebellious territories that defiance would not be tolerated. They laid siege to Albanian fortresses, devastated the countryside, and attempted to starve the population into submission. Yet time and again, they failed to achieve decisive victory. Skanderbeg's forces would withdraw into mountain strongholds, wait for Ottoman supply lines to become overextended, and then strike back with devastating effectiveness. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Albanian resistance was its longevity. This was not a brief uprising quickly suppressed, but a sustained military campaign lasting more than 2 decades. From 1443 until Skanderbeg's death in 1468, the Albanians maintained active resistance against one of the most powerful empires of the age. During this period, they fought and won numerous battles against Ottoman armies, most famously at the battles of Torviel, Oranik, and Albulina, where Albanian forces achieved stunning victories against much larger Ottoman forces. These victories were not merely defensive successes, but aggressive campaigns that drove Ottoman armies entirely out of Albanian territory and inflicted heavy casualties on some of the Sultan's best troops. Throughout these campaigns, opportunities for negotiated settlement arose repeatedly, especially after Albanian victories, when Skanderbeg's negotiating position was particularly strong. Ottoman envoys would arrive bearing increasingly generous offers, acknowledging Albanian military prowess and offering terms that would have been unthinkable at the beginning of the conflict. After the Battle of Albulina in 1457, where Skanderbeg decisively defeated an Ottoman army of allegedly 80,000 men with a force of less than 15,000, the Ottomans offered terms that included recognition of complete Albanian independence, no tribute payments, and establishment of formal alliance between equals. This was an extraordinary concession from an empire that rarely acknowledged any relationship of equality with other powers. Skanderbeg refused even to receive, the ambassadors sending word that there could be no discussion of any terms while Ottoman forces remained on Albanian soil. This intransigence was not mere stubbornness, but reflected a sophisticated understanding of Ottoman imperial strategy. Skanderbeg and his advisors recognized that any agreement with the Ottomans would be viewed by the empire as temporary, a tactical concession to be reversed when circumstances permitted. The Ottoman Empire operated according to the principle that all lands not under Muslim rule were, in theory, territories to be eventually incorporated into the Dar al-Islam. Truces and treaties with non-Muslim powers were traditionally understood as temporary arrangements lasting only until the Ottoman Empire was ready to resume expansion. By refusing to engage in negotiations at all, Skanderbeg avoided the trap of legitimizing Ottoman claims to Albania or creating the impression that Albanian independence was somehow contingent upon Ottoman forbearance rather than being an inherent right. The steadfastness of the Albanian Knights was tested not only by Ottoman military pressure, but also by the hardships imposed upon their own people by the prolonged conflict. Warfare devastated the Albanian countryside. Ottoman armies, frustrated by their inability to defeat Skanderbeg in battle, increasingly resorted to scorched earth tactics, burning villages, destroying crops, and carrying off livestock. The civilian population suffered tremendously, facing starvation, displacement, and the constant threat of violence. These conditions created pressure on the Albanian leadership to seek accommodation with the Ottomans in order to spare the population further suffering. Some nobles and clan leaders did indeed advocate for negotiations, arguing that pride and honor were worth nothing if the Albanian people were destroyed in the process of defending them. Skanderbeg faced these arguments directly, but never wavered in his conviction that surrender in any form was unacceptable. He argued that the suffering imposed by war, however terrible, was preferable to the permanent subjugation that would follow Ottoman conquest. He pointed to other Balkan peoples who had submitted to Ottoman rule and whose distinct cultures and identities were gradually being erased through the Ottoman practice of devshirme, the system by which Christian boys were taken from their families, converted to Islam, and raised as Ottoman soldiers or administrators. He reminded his followers that Albanian language, customs, and Christian faith would not long survive under Ottoman administration, regardless of any guarantees initially offered. His speeches to his warriors emphasized that they were fighting not just for themselves, but for generations yet unborn, who would either inherit freedom or slavery, depending on the choices made in the present. This rhetorical strategy proved effective in maintaining unity among the Albanian resistance, but it required more than words to sustain morale through years of hardship. Skanderbeg understood that his knights needed to believe that their cause was not hopeless, that eventual victory, or at least continued independence, was genuinely possible. To this end, he worked tirelessly to secure support from Christian powers in Western Europe who viewed the Ottoman advance with alarm. He established diplomatic relations with the papacy, Venice, Naples, and other Italian states, seeking military and financial assistance for the Albanian cause. The Pope declared Skanderbeg the champion of Christ and organized funding for Albanian resistance, while various Italian states provided weapons, supplies, and occasionally troops to support the campaign against the Ottomans. This external support, while helpful, was never sufficient to fundamentally alter the balance of power. Western European assistance was inconsistent, limited, and often motivated more by political calculations than genuine commitment to Albanian independence. Venice, for instance, sometimes supported Skanderbeg, but at other times signed separate peace treaties with the Ottomans that left Albania isolated. The promised reinforcements often failed to arrive, and the financial aid, while welcome, could not compensate for the vast disparity in resources between Albania and the Ottoman Empire. Yet these connections to the broader Christian world served an important psychological purpose, reinforcing the perception that the Albanian struggle was part of a larger civilizational conflict between Christianity and Islam, between freedom and subjugation. This framing helped sustain morale by placing Albanian resistance within a meaningful historical narrative that transcended immediate military calculations. The refusal to surrender also had profound effects on Ottoman strategy in the region. The persistent Albanian resistance tied down significant Ottoman military resources that might otherwise have been employed elsewhere. During the crucial years when Mehmed II was consolidating his power and planning the final assault on Constantinople, he had to contend with the ongoing Albanian insurgency threatening his western flank. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, when the Ottoman Empire might have expected to expand rapidly into Central Europe, Albanian resistance continued to present a formidable obstacle. The Ottomans could not safely advance into Italy or mount major campaigns in Hungary, while a hostile and militarily capable Albania threatened their supply lines and rear areas. In this sense, the Albanian refusal to accept surrender had strategic consequences far beyond the borders of Albania itself, affecting the broader trajectory of Ottoman expansion in Europe. The personal cost to Skanderbeg and his knights was immense. Many of the Albanian nobles who joined the resistance lost everything. Their estates were confiscated or destroyed, their families were killed or scattered, and they spent years living in harsh conditions, in mountain fortresses and military camps. Skanderbeg himself, despite his military successes, never enjoyed peace or security. He was constantly campaigning, constantly organizing defenses, constantly seeking support from reluctant allies. His correspondence reveals a man fully aware of the odds against him, but utterly committed to his chosen course. In letters to European monarchs and the Pope, he described the Albanian struggle in terms that emphasized both the nobility of the cause and the desperate nature of their situation, appealing for aid while making clear that Albanian resistance would continue with or without external support. The nature of medieval warfare meant that this resistance was not merely a matter of grand strategic campaigns, but involved countless small-scale actions and continuous vigilance. Albanian knights led raids into Ottoman-controlled territory, disrupted trade routes, and harassed Ottoman garrisons. They defended fortress after fortress against Ottoman sieges, enduring months of bombardment and deprivation. The siege warfare of this period was brutal and exhausting. Defenders faced starvation, disease, and the constant psychological pressure of knowing that surrender meant death or slavery. Yet Albanian fortresses held out far longer than military logic suggested they should, maintained by garrisons whose refusal to surrender stemmed from the same cultural values and personal honor that animated their leaders. The Ottoman response to this intransigence grew increasingly harsh as the conflict continued. Initially, the Ottomans had hoped to incorporate Albania into their empire relatively intact, preserving local administrative structures under ultimate Ottoman authority. As Albanian resistance persisted and Ottoman casualties mounted, this approach gave way to a policy of systematic devastation. Ottoman commanders were ordered to destroy Albanian resistance utterly, to leave nothing that could sustain continued warfare. As villages were burned, populations were deported, and captured Albanian fighters were executed rather than being offered the chance to join Ottoman service, as was common with prisoners from other regions. This brutalization of the conflict only reinforced the Albanian conviction that no accommodation with the Ottomans was possible, that they truly were fighting for survival in the most literal sense. Among the Albanian knights themselves, the refusal to surrender became a point of intense pride and identity. Stories of those who chose death over submission circulated widely, becoming part of the Albanian martial tradition. Knights who found themselves captured but refused to renounce their allegiance to Skanderbeg or convert to Islam were celebrated as martyrs. These men understood that they could have saved their lives by accepting Ottoman terms, by agreeing to serve in the Ottoman military, or by simply abandoning the resistance, yet they chose certain death instead. Their sacrifice reinforced the collective commitment to resistance, creating a culture where surrender was literally unthinkable and where continuing the fight was the only response consistent with personal and collective honor. This cultural dimension of the Albanian resistance cannot be overstated. While military capabilities and strategic calculations certainly mattered, the fundamental explanation for Albanian refusal to surrender lies in the realm of values, identity, and collective psychology. The Albanian Knights saw themselves as defending not merely territory or political independence, but their entire way of life, their ancestral traditions, and their conception of themselves as free men. In the feudal culture of medieval Albania, a man's worth was measured by his courage, his loyalty to his lord and comrades, and his willingness to fight for his beliefs regardless of the odds. Surrender, especially to a foreign and non-Christian power, violated all of these values simultaneously, and was therefore worse than death. As Skanderbeg aged and the long years of warfare took their toll, questions about succession and the long-term sustainability of Albanian resistance became increasingly pressing. Skanderbeg had united the fractious Albanian clans through force of personality, military genius, and consistent success in battle. It was unclear whether any successor could maintain this unity after his death. The Ottomans understood this vulnerability and increased their efforts to drive wedges between different Albanian factions, offering generous terms to individual nobles if they would break with Skanderbeg. Some accepted these offers, calculating that continued resistance was futile and that the best they could hope for was to preserve something of their position under Ottoman rule. Yet the core of Albanian resistance, the knights and nobles most closely associated with Skanderbeg, remained steadfast, refusing Ottoman overtures regardless of how attractive they might appear. When Skanderbeg died in January 1468, probably from malaria, the Ottomans expected Albanian resistance to collapse rapidly. They had already begun planning campaigns to finally subdue the Albanian territories, confident that without Skanderbeg's leadership, the remaining resistance would quickly sue for peace. Indeed, Ottoman envoys immediately approached Albanian leaders with offers of amnesty and favorable terms for those who would acknowledge Ottoman authority. These offers were more generous than any previously extended, recognizing the valor of Albanian resistance and offering substantial autonomy and privileges in exchange for submission. The Ottomans genuinely believed that most Albanians would accept these terms once they realized that continued resistance without Skanderbeg was hopeless. To Ottoman surprise, Albanian resistance continued for more than a decade after Skanderbeg's death. His successors, though lacking his military genius, maintained the same uncompromising rejection of Ottoman rule. The fortress of Kruja, Skanderbeg's stronghold, held out until 1478, enduring multiple sieges and holding out for 10 years after the death of the man who had made it a symbol of Albanian resistance. When it finally fell, the Albanian defenders had been reduced to starvation but still refused to surrender, forcing the Ottomans to take the fortress by storm. Other Albanian strongholds followed similar patterns, holding out far longer than seemed militarily rational, sustained by the same refusal to submit that had characterized Albanian resistance from the beginning. The final phase of Albanian resistance was marked by a gradual but inexorable Ottoman advance. Without Skanderbeg to coordinate strategy and maintain unity, Albanian forces fought increasingly isolated actions, each fortress or clan defending its own territory. The Ottomans, learning from their earlier failures, adopted a strategy of methodical conquest, reducing Albanian strongholds one by one while preventing any effective coordination between remaining resistance forces. They also increased settlement of Turkish populations in conquered Albanian territories, beginning the process of demographic change that would eventually transform the religious and cultural character of Albania. Yet even in defeat, the Albanian knights maintained their characteristic refusal to surrender on Ottoman terms. Those who could fled to Italy, establishing Albanian exile communities that preserved their language and culture. Others retreated to the most remote mountain areas where Ottoman control was difficult to establish. Very few accepted Ottoman offers of amnesty and incorporation into the Ottoman system. The legacy of these Albanian knights, who refused every offer of surrender, extended far beyond their immediate historical moment. Their resistance became a foundational myth of Albanian national identity, a story of defiance against overwhelming odds that would inspire future generations. During the centuries of Ottoman rule that followed, Albanians preserved memory of Skanderbeg and his knights as symbols of an independent Albanian spirit that could never be fully conquered. The refusal to surrender became emblematic of Albanian national character, a defining characteristic that Albanians pointed to with pride. When Albanian independence movements emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries, they consistently invoked Skanderbeg and the medieval Albanian resistance as proof that Albanians had never truly accepted foreign domination, and that the struggle for independence was merely a continuation of a fight begun in the 15th century. The question of whether the Albanian refusal to surrender was strategically wise or tragically futile has been debated by historians. Some argue that accepting Ottoman terms, particularly after Skanderbeg's death when continued military resistance appeared hopeless, might have preserved more of Albanian autonomy and culture than the prolonged warfare that ultimately ended in Ottoman conquest anyway. They point to other Balkan Christian populations that maintained distinct identities under Ottoman rule and eventually achieved independence in the 19th century, suggesting that the same might have been possible for Albania without the devastation of decades of warfare. According to this view, the Albanian insistence on absolute rejection of any accommodation with Ottoman power was a form of destructive pride that led to unnecessary suffering and ultimately failed to prevent Ottoman conquest. The contrary argument emphasizes that the Albanian resistance, even though it ended in military defeat, preserved something essential about Albanian identity that might have been lost through accommodation. By refusing to surrender and fighting to the bitter end, the Albanian knights established a tradition of resistance that sustained Albanian national consciousness through centuries of foreign rule. They demonstrated that Albanians could stand against even the mightiest empires, and, while they might be conquered militarily, they would never willingly submit. This tradition of defiance contributed to the preservation of Albanian language and culture under Ottoman rule, and ultimately to the emergence of an independent Albanian state in the 20th century. From this perspective, the refusal to surrender was not futile, but rather a necessary assertion of Albanian identity that had profound long-term consequences despite the immediate military defeat. What remains indisputable is that the Albanian knights who refused every offer of surrender displayed extraordinary courage and commitment to their principles. They faced the most powerful empire of their age, fought for decades against impossible odds, and never wavered in their determination to maintain Albanian independence, regardless of the cost. Their story is one of exceptional valor in the face of overwhelming force, of men who chose principle over pragmatism and honor over survival. Whether one views their choice as heroic or tragic, it stands as one of the most remarkable episodes of resistance in medieval European history, a testament to the power of determination and the enduring human drive for freedom and self-determination.